ANA eLearning Academy is brought to you by CDN Graysheet, a trusted source of rare coin and currency valuations since 1963.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being on the class today. Thank you for joining us for the ANA eLearning Academy. The ANA would like to thank our e-learning partner, Graysheet, for their support of the e-learning program. Today, we've got Alex Magnolia, and he's going to be presenting on overstrikes. Forgive me, I'm going to botch this, I bet. Politics, economics, and Damnatio Memoriae on Byzantine coins. You're going to be muted for this presentation, so if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat or the Q&A box, and I'll read them out loud to Alex at the very end of the presentation. So let's get this going. Without further ado, I hand this over to Alex. Thank you.
Thank you, Logan. Thank you so much for the introduction and talking about the subject. I've tried to keep Greek and Latin to a minimum, so it will pop up occasionally, I guess, given the nature of the subject matter. But yeah, I'm really excited to be here. I'll give a very brief bio and introduction just before we begin. So like Logan said, I'm Alex Magnolia. I am a PhD candidate in history at the University of Minnesota. So that means I am, let's see, I don't know, too many years into the PhD. I'm at the dissertation stage right now, so I'm embarking on a gigantic writing project, which hopefully will be done at some point in the indefinite future. Specifically, my research area is the sort of middle Byzantine period, high Byzantine period, whatever you want to call it. 10th century is generally what I work on. I've been really privileged to teach a lot of classes at the University of Minnesota and lecture at a number of different places and institutions. And I love Byzantium. I love sharing Byzantine history with the public in particular, because it's such an important epoch of human history that is very rarely taught in American education. Even at the college level, it would be very rare to have a Byzantine history course or even a sort of university class that touches on Byzantium. So hopefully I can teach us a little bit and try and remedy some of that. I feel like another important point to make, but I forgot it. So we'll get there when we get there. Oh, I'm actually originally from Colorado. So ANA, shout out to Colorado Springs. I'm from Colorado Springs and spent a lot of time in that area. So I miss it. I'm currently in rainy, damp Minnesota, which is just having sheets of water today. Okay, so I'm going to start out with a brief discussion of Byzantine history from a sort of 30,000-foot perspective, just in order to establish the historic context of the subject that we're talking about today. I would hate to just jump directly into the coins without giving you any introduction into the politics and economics and the social structures of the society with which we're dealing. This is, of course, a very famous quote if you do history, so I'll let you analyze it. So a brief introduction to Byzantium. This little hand that follows us along through our slides is called a maniculum. It's really common in medieval manuscripts, and it sort of points out things that the author really wanted you to know in said manuscript. So this is a map which I like because it shows comparisons of Byzantine territory throughout the medieval period. So under Justinian, a Byzantine emperor who many of you probably know or have heard of, I mean, not know him personally, but you've heard of Justinian, the empire reached its largest extent and recaptured much of the former Western Roman territories. So the empire had been divided into the Eastern and the Western Roman states, but Justinian was able to reconquer many areas, particularly of the West and, toeholds and swaths of North Africa. Throughout the medieval period, obviously, Byzantium declined significantly in territorial size, but it also fluctuated. So, for example, this map indicates that in about 1020, under the Emperor Basil II, there was actually quite a growth and an expansion of Byzantine territory. But through the rise of the Carolingians, the rise of Islam, the development of the Bulgarian state, obviously the territory expands and contracts over time, until we're left with this very sad little rump state of Byzantine territory in the 14th century, pretty much just reduced to Constantinople in the following century, and then it's, of course, taken by the Turks in 1453. We're actually just a few days away from the anniversary of the capture of Constantinople. It's every year on May 29th. So if you want something to celebrate or to remember the fall of Constantinople this Saturday. Okay, at any rate, so I'll go over briefly some important elements of the medieval Roman society. So the state generally was considered a fairly strong centralized monarchy throughout the Middle Ages. There was one emperor, sometimes a co-ruler, sometimes they had a regent. There were also female emperors, so empresses, which was not normal in the Middle Ages, but it did happen in Byzantium. Many dynasties are well known from Byzantine history. So whereas the classical Roman Empire and Republic, at least nominally, didn't like dynastic succession, in Byzantium this wasn't really considered problematic. And we'll actually talk in detail today about two of the dynasties, those of Heraclius and the Macedonian dynasty in Byzantium. The capital city of Constantinople was really, really important for this empire, for these people, because it was, on the one hand, both highly defensible. It had natural defenses of being surrounded by water on three sides, and on the side that wasn't surrounded by water, and actually on the harbor sides as well, there were enormous, colossal walls which had been built in the 4th century. They were considered so strong and so impregnable that in fact only 2 sieges of Constantinople were successful for 1,000 years. One of them was the Fourth Crusade in 1204, and the other was obviously the final conquest of the city in 1453. So the importance of Constantinople as the economic and political and spiritual capital of this empire cannot be overstated. Byzantium also developed a very elaborate system of, as I've indicated here, court titles and rituals and ranks. And these became really important in establishing a sort of professional bureaucracy, which helped run and manage the state and helped it survive for so long. In particular, we have several surviving manuals of basically how to run the empire, how to run the court and ceremonials from the 10th century. They're super fascinating and very accessible. You can easily find these and read them yourselves in translations. Another important thing to note, and particularly important for our economic discussion and our coinage discussion, is that the ruler was a crucial source of wealth and of the money in the state. So as far as we understand it, and obviously over the 1,000 years of Byzantium, the state changes significantly, but so I'm generalizing here to an extent, but as far as we understand it, the main driver of the Byzantine economy would have been direct payments made to the army and to court officials. And with each of these court offices came generally a state salary of any quantity of gold, sometimes to the extent of pounds and pounds of gold would have been paid to these court officials. I like this image here to the left because this is Emperor Theophilos in the 9th century, or the 8th century, excuse me. No, the 9th century. Probably surrounded by his courtiers and his supporters, and they have really cool hats also, so there's that. I'll talk briefly about the Byzantine Church as well, because this is one of the main legacies that has survived into the modern period. So in Byzantium, the majority of the people, or at least the sort of publicly professed religion, was Orthodox Christianity. Although it's worth noting this is still a sort of unified form of Christianity that's linked with the Church of Rome up until the schism in the 11th century. These people probably would not have called themselves Orthodox, they probably just would have called themselves Christians. So they, especially the sort of lay people, the simple folk, didn't really recognize these divisions that we categorize it along today. Whereas in the West, there was a sense of papal primacy, that the Pope is the sort of chief officer and ruler and doctrinal authority of the Western Church. In the East, it's a little bit different. So the Orthodox Church does have a patriarch, which is an appointed office. It's appointed by the emperor, and they are appointed to sort of manage the day-to-day affairs of the church and act in a sort of papal role, but they didn't have that same infallibility. Also, the Eastern Church tended to rely much more on ecumenical councils. So rather than a sort of universal decree of the patriarch, the patriarch saw his role, very generally speaking, as assembling a sort of council or committee of church leaders to make decisions on important issues. The church, of course, would have been a very central institution of everyday life in the Middle Ages. So any number of feasts and festivals and rituals and spectacles. These all would have been strongly connected to participation in the church. Obviously, the church was also a great patron of the arts after the iconoclast period and before the iconoclast period. The church was extremely wealthy. It controlled a great deal of land. It was, right alongside the state, the main institution of life for people living in this empire. And historians have identified what they call a sort of mutuality or symphony. That's the Greek word originally, symphonia, between the church and the state. And I like this image on the right, which is from, I think, a 12th century manuscript, a very famous manuscript, the Madrid Skylitzes. This image shows the figure on the right is the patriarch Nikephoros or Nicephorus crowning the Byzantine emperor. And as the Roman emperors traditionally did, it was on a shield being held by soldiers. But it's this really fascinating moment because just as the patriarch is blessing and crowning the emperor also appoints the office of patriarch. So presumably when this individual died, when the patriarch died, the emperor would pick his replacement, and that patriarch then would coronate the next emperor. So there was this degree of sort of harmony and cooperation between these two offices of emperor and patriarch. Another thing I always like to note is that while I use the term Byzantium today or the adjective Byzantine, this is not how people referred to themselves. This term did not exist outside of a few very specific uses until the early modern period, when it was coined by a German scholar who's thinking about these people. But throughout the Middle Ages, from the 5th to 15th century, these people would have simply referred to themselves as Roman. They were a direct continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire. They would not have used the word Byzantine to describe themselves. They would have called themselves Roman. So without getting too deep into it, it's a very sort of political and hot topic in scholarship right now. But scholars today use Roman or medieval Roman or Eastern Roman or sometimes Byzantine to describe these people. Of course, the word Byzantine itself has a little bit of sort of magic and theater to it. So I like it for that reason, even though it's not particularly accurate. But ultimately, these were the people that we're dealing with here were Greek-speaking, Christian, Hellenized Roman citizens living under a monarchy. Unfortunately, that very long sentence isn't a great sort of, casual identifier. So just bear that in mind. Okay, so I'll move on to our next subject here. And I forgot to share a sort of anecdote at the beginning of the talk, so I'd like to share that right now with you very briefly. So I was once chatting with a friend about, and a friend and a fellow numismatist about his collection, and he had recently purchased an overstruck Byzantine coin, and he added it to his collection, and he was really excited about it. So, and just sort of jokingly, he said, "Oh, the reason it was struck like this is because the minter or the worker who was making it must have been drunk. He must have been drunk at work." And being a scholar of Byzantium, I tried to sort of gently correct him and say that, these overstrikes are actually kind of common and they're a really fascinating part of Byzantine history. So I don't think he was drunk. It's a bit more complicated than that. And after that, this person wasn't super interested in chatting with me about his collection anymore. But the point of this anecdote is that I hope if you take away anything from this presentation, it's that these civilizations of the past with whom we're dealing today, they weren't crude or simple or foolish in comparison to us, but that they applied their own reason and their logic as they understood it to solve the problems of their age. Anyway. So I love this quote. I just recently found it in the last few weeks. This is by St. John Chrysostomus, or John Chrysostom, who was bishop and patriarch of Constantinople and one of the most important church figures of the late antique period. And in one of his sermons, this is from Patrologia Graeca, he wrote, "The use of coin welds together our whole life and is the basis of all of our transactions. Whenever anything is to be bought or sold, we do it all through coins." I love this. Very rarely do scholars or do sources from this period actually talk about coins. So I just wanted to share this with you and talk about the importance of the monetary economy in Byzantium. So a very brief history of Byzantine coins, so that I can explain the strikes later. We should have this, baseline knowledge. So the Byzantine economy and the monetary economy were remarkable in that, like the empire itself, this endured for about 1,000 years and in some ways became a model for Western Europe. Of course, there were a number of changes over time. Certain coins were introduced and then dropped out of circulation or debased. So probably we should, if we're speaking very specifically, say that there were 4 or 5 different monetary systems in Byzantium, but they all have the same overarching foundation. So the main gold coins from the period that we're looking at are the solidus, which of course is the exact same name as the Roman gold coin. It's also known in Greek as the nomisma, so I'll refer to it as both. I like nomisma better because of course it's where we get the term numismatics. And then they also had the tremesis and the semisis, which are fractional gold pieces. So I believe the tremesis was 1/3 of a solidus, and the semisis, obviously with the word semi, is 1/2. There were a few silver denominations as well. The siliqua was rare. It was discontinued in the 6th century. The hexagram, which was this very sort of chunky silver coin, if you've ever seen one, the flan on which it's produced is a very strange size. And then the miliaresion, we will look at some examples of today, and that's more common, introduced in the 7th century, and it circulates until the 11th. They're very, very thin, fine coins. And then, of course, there were also various copper denominations. The main one, which had a value of 40 numi, is just called a phallus. But there were other minor copper issues in various sizes throughout this period. And I'll share a little bit with you about the Byzantine monetary economy as well, research that scholars have written. So many scholars suggest that Byzantine coins, especially in the 6th and 7th centuries, they circulated from anywhere between 60 to 100 years. And we'll look at some really fascinating examples of this. And this research is based on a few different scholars, but notably Cécile Morisson, who has written that a survey of archaeological sites in Asia Minor, I think she published this in about 2006, indicates that gold coins probably circulated for even longer in Byzantium, maybe up to 120 years, whereas most bronze and copper coins circulated for 80 to 90 years maximum. We know there was also a pretty significant monetary policy change beginning in the 7th century, but I'll get to that in just a second. So, yes. So actually, I'll talk about this monetary policy change now. So in about 610, we know that a really important coining or moneying office, which had been established by Constantine the Great, kind of disappeared. It ceased to exist. This was called the office of the Count of the Sacred Largesse. It was probably absorbed into other parts of the bureaucracy, but just one moment. So by the mid-8th century, after some of these monetary policy changes, we have, at least from a historical perspective, we have a really nice monetary system that starts to emerge because it was trimetallic and tri-denominational, meaning there's one coin for each metal, and yeah, so it's fairly straightforward. I've chosen 3 coins here of the Empress Irene, not only because Irene is amazing and she's a wonderful historical figure to study, but also because this is just a perfect demonstration. So the gold is the solidus or nomisma. This beautifully toned silver is the miliaresion, and then this copper coin is the phallus. So I also have a chart of values on the next page that I'll show you in order that we can understand how much these are worth. So on the left is this sort of pre-reform monetary system that has lots of different denominations. And on the right, this is the simpler trimetallic denomination system. So there's just the solidus, the miliaresion, and the phallus. We know that in general in Byzantium, the supply of copper in particular for minting coins was not elastic. So overstrikes, which we'll discuss in a minute, were a practical way of recirculating currency and allowing the emperor or the empress's image to circulate on existing coins rather than having to acquire bullion and melt new ones, or mint new ones, rather. There are also a few periods of really dramatic economic decline in Byzantium, and the 7th century is one of them. Part of the 7th and actually the early 8th century are sort of considered a dark age in Byzantine history, which is not a term historians like to use anymore, but it's still functional in in the popular imagination. In fact, the monetary supply was so scarce at this time that the state seized copper from the roofs of public buildings in order to mint coins, and even more sort of sacrilegiously, they seized all of the silver artifacts from churches in order to mint down for the new hexagram coin. So if you have a Byzantine hexagram, or if you see one, there's a very good chance that it's made from melted down silver church material, liturgical objects, church candelabras, what have you. Okay, so I'll jump to the next one here. I already talked a little bit about the circulation policy or the circulation patterns of Byzantine coins. It's also worth noting that while copper coins are far more common on the market today and in archaeological discoveries for the most part, I mean, they are the most numerous examples of surviving Byzantine coins that have made it to us today. The majority of the value of the Byzantine economy was almost certainly in gold. So most historians believe that the primary driver of the Byzantine economy would have been large payments of gold to the army and the court, which I already mentioned. But probably this is something like 90% or more of the value of the economy would have been in the circulation of gold. We do have some records that money changers were important in Byzantium, but outside of a few law codes and books of that nature, there's not that many sources about money changing in Byzantium. I'll actually talk about that in a little bit. There's not that many sources about money in Byzantium at all, other than the coins themselves. Just in terms of thinking about the value of the overall economy, silver coins were minted far less frequently in Byzantium, but they still made some appearances. And throughout the medieval period, the Byzantine economy remained very highly monetized. This is, of course, to say that the level of monetization would certainly have been higher in the capital of Constantinople and in large cities like Thessaloniki. But whereas in the countryside, probably payments in kind were just as likely and common, or even more so than money. But at any rate, so I've talked about the trimetallic system. I think we're probably ready to move on. I should speak a little bit more about taxes, actually. All of our favorite subject matter. So gold was required in many cases as the main source of payments, taxes, rent, salaries, what have you, throughout the Byzantine period. So this is a quote from the historian Cécile Morisson, who wrote, the result was a distribution of gold among the lower ranks of society, not only soldiers, but also artisans, peasants, hermits, holy persons, prostitutes, and so on. And even though we're only talking about very small amounts of gold, these folks still had to pay their taxes to the state in that. But the change they were given back, because it was unlikely that an average person would owe that much money to the state, the change that they would be given back would be in low value silver or copper currency. So yeah, just something to note. I find that kind of interesting. So I'll speak a little bit about overstrikes now. I've got two definitions here, just so we're all on the same page. Well, okay, I'll read them for you. So according to Dumbarton Oakes, an overstrike is a coin for which an older coin was used as a blank and on which traces of the earlier imprint, also known as the undertype, are still visible. And according to David MacDonald, these are coins that have been recoined by striking them with new and different dies, whether by the original minting authority or by a different one, without having the original design completely removed beforehand. So just to engage the audience a little bit, do you all have any ideas of modern examples of overstrikes? Do you have like an overstrike in your collection that you're particularly fond of that you want to share? I'm not exactly sure how this will work because I think everyone is muted, but perhaps you can type it in the Q&A or something like that. Sorry to put you on the spot, Logan. I don't know how this works, but
no, you're good. anything that comes through the Q&A, I'll go ahead and make sure to read out loud to you. If it's in the chat, you'll obviously be able to see it.
Okay. Ah, there it is. Okay, I didn't see the chat bar up there. Yeah, so if no one has any favorite examples of modern overstrikes, I'll share with you my favorite example, which is 19th century Brazil. Oh no, there was supposed to be more text on that slide, or maybe perhaps not. That's 19th century Brazil. So these are particularly fascinating examples that perhaps you might be more familiar with than something as esoteric as Byzantium. So beginning in about 1810, the state of Brazil began to overstrike coins worth 960 reais, which I believe is how you pronounce this word, R-E-I-S. I asked a friend from Brazil and she said that's it. But anyway, so the Brazilian state began to restrike these coins worth 960 reais on a number of different crown-sized silver coins. There are a number of these examples, and they're all fascinating, but these include Spanish 8 reales, British crowns, even some early US silver dollars were overstruck by the state of Brazil. This particular coin is, I believe, overstruck on a Spanish or Peruvian 8 reales before being repurposed by the Brazilian state. And the history behind this is that in the early 1900s or 1800s, Brazil was still a colony of Portugal. But when Napoleon invaded Portugal, this forced the royal family there to flee across the Atlantic to Rio de Janeiro. It's estimated that about 10,000 elite Portuguese, particularly the royal court and many of these wealthy noble families, they fled to Brazil because of Napoleon's invasion. So Rio, for a time at least, becomes the seat of the overall Portuguese empire. The massive upkeep cost of paying for the royal court and all their salaries was way too expensive for the colonial economy of Brazil to bear. So in order to pay for these expenses, João VI, the emperor, ordered that any Spanish 8 reales coins that were found in the empire or that were circulating there, which were valued at 800 reais on the international market, had to be restruck or counterstamped as 960 reais. So this is a way of sort of creating profit for the state, seigniorage is what we call it, that helped keep João and his family in, comfortable in their new home. But these coins are particularly cool. I mean, according to me, that's the formal academic term, cool, because you can see very clear examples of the undertypes underneath. So I've just included some indications here. There are in many cases lettering that you can still see to make out the legend that was on the previous coin, or there are just as many examples where you can actually see, for example, the pillars of the Spanish pillar dollar, or the volcano of the Chile volcano peso. I'm just pointing out a few more examples here. This is the very characteristic pillar with this sort of plus ultra banner on it, on one of these 960 reais coins, and then there is also very clearly some lettering that has still survived on this. So this is a favorite example of mine from Brazil, but this phenomenon also happened in France in the late 1600s and early 1700s, notably on the French crown-sized coin, the écu. So many of these large silver coins were taken out of circulation and then overstruck or restruck. I didn't look into the purpose for which this was done, but I believe these might be colonial circulations. So they may have been originally minted for circulation in the French colonies and then restruck with Louis XIV, or perhaps vice versa. But at any rate, you can still see clearly the overtype and the undertype on these coins. They call the undertype the host coin. So let's talk about Byzantine overstrikes. This is why we're all here, and I'm very excited to share this with you. So a few introductory remarks about this subject. First, there is very, very little scholarship on the phenomenon of overstriking in Byzantium. When it is mentioned by historians at all, it's primarily associated with economic reforms. It's associated with moving coinage around the economy, or a way to save money by creating that degree of profit for the state of reissuing old coins rather than minting entirely new ones. I also want to push back on the notion that this was done for reasons of sloppiness or inattention or lack of skill of these artisans and these mint masters, because throughout the millennium of Byzantine history, there are many dark periods, but the darkest periods don't see overstriking, generally speaking. So as I've noted here, there were two main appearances of overstriking in Byzantine history, the 580s through the 620s and the 920s through roughly the 1060s intermittently. Do you have any theories on what might have been going on in these periods, or let's test your knowledge of Byzantine history? You can use Q&A or the chat. I don't know how it works. Or if you don't have any theories on what was going on in this period, there was nothing going on. The whole world was silent. I can tell you what was going on. So in the first case, 580s through 620s, there was a fairly substantial civil war. And in fact, there had been quite a long period of, generally speaking, peace in the Roman Empire. But starting in about 600, this peaceful period ended. So around 600, possibly 602, Roman soldiers rebel in the Balkans. And they made one of their own officers or commanders emperor in a violent coup in which the former emperor, who refused to pay the army, was deposed and his whole family was put to death. Sorry, Maurice. That was his name. So this particular emperor who took over was called Phocas. He rules for about 8 years, and then he's deposed in another major civil war. So just in this short period, we have 2 civil wars. Shortly after this, Heraclius, who is the victor of the civil war, who takes over, he then faces a catastrophic war with Persia, which devastates this whole large region between these 2 great empires. So there's an economic collapse, a currency collapse. This is when the church silver was raided, and then, as I noted here, there's a big increase in overstriking activity. The second period of overstrikes is a little bit different, though. So this begins roughly in the 920s and lasts until the 1060s, with starts and stops throughout the time. But this period is different because it was actually reasonably stable in Byzantium. And not only that, it was actually a time of territorial expansion. So there were many strong rulers, good generals. The Byzantines retook some of the islands in the Aegean. They took cities in Asia Minor. They raided all the way down into Islamic Syria. So this is the period I mentioned earlier of the Macedonian Dynasty, which has a pattern of child emperors, and then child emperors being ruled by a strong man or strong woman or their regent. So let's deal with the first period first. So as I mentioned, there's very few sources for talking about Byzantine overstrikes. The textual sources, so that is chronicles, letters, hagiography, liturgy, histories, speeches, poetry, these sorts of things. These sources just don't exist on how to do numismatic history in Byzantium. These people very rarely talked about the coins they used in sort of elite educated discourse. I'll point to the example of Procopius, who's a very famous historian of the 6th century. And he wrote thousands and thousands of pages on the wars of Justinian, the buildings of Justinian. And as far as I know, I'm fairly familiar with Procopius, he mentions coins once. As I've noted here, the way in which Byzantine people wrote history just generally didn't include discussions of detailed things like coins, unless a ruler did something particularly scandalous or nefarious. So the base of my material here is actually talking about the coins themselves. So my argument here, what I'm advancing, is that these 2 very different periods of Byzantine overstrikes were made up of 2 phenomena. So in the first case, this was a primarily economic function, but also had strong political aspects, as these 2 different dynasties, the unsuccessful dynasty of Phocas and the fairly successful dynasty of Heraclius, struggled to be seen as legitimate. And in the second case, that of the Macedonian dynasty, I think overstriking was primarily political. Many different usurpers, regents, or rulers quite literally overstruck their faces above the faces of their predecessors to cement their legacy and their right to have this highly contested throne of Byzantium. Okay, so let's talk about actual examples. I have many images sort of peppered in here of overstrike coins. So the first is this is a phallus of Heraclius, 610 to 630, with an illegible date. If you didn't know what you were looking at, you would probably just say that this is a poorly struck coin or possibly a double struck coin. And you could easily ignore this and say, okay, well, it's just double struck. The minting process in Byzantium often required 2 strikes when creating a new coin. So you might just ignore this, sure, whatever. Yeah, it's worth noting that the coins probably had to be struck several times. So seeing double strikes is not that unusual. But it takes a bit of scrutiny and a bit of practice in your gaze to look at this and to see that this is in fact an overstruck coin of Heraclius on top of an or of an unknown host coin. So this is the example, or these are some of the indications that this is an overstrike. So next time you're browsing a Byzantine coin dealer's inventory, look for these sorts of things. So first, there's this sort of ring around the portrait, which is overlapping the bust, and this is not normal. Also, the appearance of Roman numerals right underneath Heraclius's face is not normal, because that's a good indication that this used to be the reverse of another coin. And while, of course, this could be a situation of clashed dies, that you have the obverse and the reverse on the same side, I don't think this is the case here. And another tactic I like to use is to rotate the coin to see if any other orientation might make sense of how to read the mint mark or how to read any of the other evidence. So I've rotated it here for us. So if we rotate it like that, we can actually see that these are clear indications of this originally being someone else's coin, of another emperor's coin. So we can use the regnal years at the right, which are these Roman numerals, to indicate that this was minted in the 2nd year of someone else's reign. We can also see, if we look real carefully here, I think this is a pretty clear indication of another mint mark. So this is the C of the CON mint mark, which is Constantinople. And when we rotate the coin like this and actually see the lettering, you can read that this is also the inscription which tells you what year it was made in. So all of these coins on the reverse say Anno and then a number. So this was made in Anno 2 at the Constantinople mint of someone else's reign and overstruck by Heraclius during his reign. Unfortunately, there are not many other clues that can give us indications of whose coin this was, unless we sit here for many hours and look at it. Now this, on the other hand, this next coin, these are pretty unambiguous overstrikes. So these are these are much more obvious and kind of in some ways more fun to look at. You do not need a practiced eye or a learned gaze to look at this. The trouble with these sorts of coins then is actually identifying who is the host coin, which is oftentimes garbled or kind of impossible to read. So the overtype is very clearly a phallus of Constans II Pogonatos, which I think means the bearded. I'm pretty sure it means the bearded. He is the grandson of the great-grandson of Heraclius. And so we can date this phallus to 641 to 668, but it's very obviously overstruck on someone else's coin because the bust is clear in this image. So I've rotated them just a little bit in order to make this more clear and more visible. So, oh no, I thought I had arrows pointing to it. Apparently I don't have arrows, my apologies. So instead what we have here, we clearly are able to see that this coin, which is the reverse of the Constans coin, is the obverse of someone else's coin, because there's a front-facing bust, which was very common after the reforms of Justinian in the 530s. So this front-facing bust, so you can sort of see it here. There's a cross. This would have been a globus cruciger that the emperor is holding. It's a sort of sphere with a cross at the top, and then he's wearing armor. So clearly this was someone else's bust, And then we can see on what was the reverse of the other coin, which is the obverse of the new one, that this was minted at Kyzikos due to the KYZ mint mark. So then we can narrow that down, because we know that from other historical evidence, the mint at Kyzikos permanently closed in 630. And the front-facing bust begins to appear in the 530s. So using other historical information, despite the real difficulty of reading the legend, this coin could be as early, actually, I think it could be earlier than Maurice Tiberius. I think it could be as early as, Justinian. It could be from the 530s. It could be from the early 7th century. But at any rate, the fact that we know this was made between 640 and 668 roughly, this coin could have been in circulation for decades, many decades, before it was overstruck by the new emperor. So at any rate, these are some sort of tips and tricks for identifying overstrikes, should you ever come across them. This is one of my favorites. This image comes from Doug Smith, and this is probably a double overstrike or a triple struck coin, where we have 3 different imperial offices, all sort of vying for legitimacy, all fighting for the imperial throne right on the same coin. So this one is super cool. So the first, I've highlighted these here with numbers. You can see these 2 standing figures. So these are Heraclius and his sons. There should be another one on Heraclius's other side, but that part of the strike didn't make it through. So that's the first clear indicator, is that the overtype of this coin is clearly Heraclius. But then we also have lettering here. So I've highlighted that with this sort of bean-shaped thing here at the bottom of the obverse. So the lettering is TIB and OC. So these letters would have never gone together. There's no emperor who would have used these letters together. So this has to be 2 different inscriptions on top of one another, one being Tiberius and the other being Phocas OC. And then also this third image here, perhaps I should have rotated it. That's a very traditional crown that the Emperor Phocas is shown in on his coins. So this is really remarkable, because this particular coin, of course, it bore witness to many historical events, and it's remarkable that it has survived, 1400 years. But this small piece of copper is direct evidence of these, 30 years of civil wars in Byzantium. So if we ignore the political and historical implications of overstrikes, we ignore so at our own peril. And of course, you can see on the reverse as well, there's many garbled images here. There's at least 2 strikes on the reverse. We would need to read it more carefully. Okay, so I'm going to jump 3 centuries in the future now to the Macedonian Dynasty of Byzantium. While the political identity of the empire was largely the same, the capital was still at Constantinople. Much had changed. So the empire had experienced a protracted, centuries-long struggle with iconoclasm, which was a religious movement which almost destroyed the church and, frankly, the state, by trying to remove the veneration of icons from Christian worship. So iconoclasts believed that icons were a form of idolatry that went against the fundamental tenets of monotheism, and that churches should only be decorated with the simplest things, like a simple cross with no adornments, versus the elaborate, beautiful, colorful icons that the Christians had come to worship. So eventually iconoclasm is put to rest by a series of emperors in the late 700s and the mid 800s, and it goes away, thankfully. But by the 10th century, Byzantium was also no longer the dominant power in the region anymore, because by now you had the Islamic Abbasid Empire had risen to be this magnificent polity based at Baghdad, extremely educated, learned, and wealthy. And so that's sort of east and southeast of Byzantium. And then to the west of Byzantium, you have, of course, the Carolingian dynasty, which controlled, by this point, much of the former Western Roman Empire, what we might today call France and Germany and parts of Italy. So by this point, a new and stable dynasty emerges in Byzantium. Their founder, Basil I, is from northern Greece, Thrace, which was at that time called Macedonia. So this is the Macedonian dynasty. So this is an example of a Macedonian overstrike. This might be a double overstrike, but I haven't spent the time to identify this particular coin. It's not, it's not part of my collection or my scholarship. So the host coin is almost certainly a phallus of Constantinos VII, who is this Constantinos VII Porphyrogenitos. We can talk about that afterwards if you want, what that means. So this is almost certainly his coin on the right here. This would have been his face. This would have been his obverse. But then that has been overstruck by Nikephoros Phokas on the left, who ruled several generations after Constantinos had died. So this coin, to me, it doesn't really speak about the economic necessity of overstriking something. This speaks to me about a way of Nikephoros or Nicephorus trying to sort of confirm and cement his legitimate right to rule over Byzantium. And in this case, you can see the design of the phallus has changed pretty significantly. It no longer has a marker of value denomination because it was the only copper coin circulating. So if you had a copper coin, it was a phallus, period. There's no fussing with denomination at this point. But you can see here, there's also, I don't know if you can see my mouse, my thing here, but there's also an indication that these dots here probably would have been the cuirass or the chest of another emperor, which is why that leads me to believe this might be another double overstrike situation, at any rate. So I'll scoot on to the next one. This again is a very political overstrike. There are serious political overtones to this. Because as far as we know, and I've said this before, the economy was fairly stable. 10th century Byzantium was experiencing growth, not contraction. They are reconquering parts of Anatolia, which had been retaken centuries prior. And so while the sources don't speak about any economic collapse at this time, or even like major financial problems from a state perspective, we know that it's possible that the coins could have been recalled to Constantinople for whatever reason, for restriking. Yeah. So I'll finish up those remarks when we get through this. But on the left, you see actually a really nice portrait of Constantinos VII. So this I think is political for a couple of reasons. So Constantinos was born as the sort of purple-born, the legitimate child of Emperor Leo VI, the Wise. But he died, or his father died when he was only a child. So he experienced a number of different regencies, people ruling on his behalf in his name when he was a child. This began with the patriarch Nicholas Mysticus, and then his mother Zoe Carbonopsina, which means Zoe with the coal black eyes. It's the most beautiful name. But then during his mother's regency, a usurper came to power and sort of claimed that he was protecting Constantinos by installing himself and his children and his family in the palace for several decades. So this coin of Constantinos shows him as an adult, as in his full imperial regalia, but it's overstruck on a coin of his predecessor and usurper Romanos I. So while my reading of this is definitely affected by my understanding of Macedonian politics, this to me seems like a very clear and political overstrike of Constantinos asserting himself as the sole ruler after having had a lifetime of sort of usurpations and people holding power on his behalf. This seems to me as though he were sort of reclaiming an ounce of his proper imperium. So that coin was from the mid 10th century. I'm going to jump now to the mid 11th century. So this is a fairly banal example of a Constantine X phallus. It's not entirely clear to me on what host coin this was overstruck, or if the Constantine X phallus is itself the host coin. But at any rate, it's just worth noting that this phenomenon continues well into the 10th century, or the 11th century, excuse me. Because at that point, at the end of the 11th century, there's a major currency reform by the new Komnenos emperors. another great dynasty in Byzantium. So this I just thought was a particularly fun and interesting overstrike, because this is a similar design to what you just saw with Constantinos and his wife Evdokia. On the obverse, they're holding this thing called the labarum between them, which is a ceremonial sort of imperial and Christian object. And then on the reverse of this coin, we would expect it to be similar. It's supposed to be Jesus Christ enthroned. It's a very powerful symbol of Christian piety and devotion to Christ. But it's actually overstruck. So Constantinos X and Evdokia are sort of stamping out Christ on this coin, and I think the host coin is just a phallus of Constantinos himself without Evdokia on it. So there may be something to be said here about who is really ruling the state. Is it Constantine or is it his new wife, Evdokia? Because she's very clearly and unambiguously shown as a co-ruler on this coin. So something just to note there. Excuse me for a second. And then this is a very, very strange Byzantine overstrike from this same Macedonian period that I don't have a good answer for. So this again comes from Douglas Smith. He has, I think, very convincingly identified this particular coin, which is really remarkable, as a Byzantine overstrike of what's called a Christ phallus. These are anonymous coins. They don't have the names of any emperors on them, but they have a sort of a radiate bust of Christ with these words on the back, Jesus Christ, King of Kings, or Jesus Christ, ruler of rulers, something of that nature. But this has been overstruck, I believe, on a coin of Gordian III, who was the 3rd century Roman emperor. This coin it doesn't make any sense to me, but I share it with you just to show the commonality of this phenomenon. Because if this is truly a coin of Gordian III, it would have been almost 800 years old when it was restruck in Byzantium. So obviously it wasn't still circulating. I have no good answer for why this was done to this coin, but I'm fascinated by the phenomenon, and it's just to me such a powerful example of this phenomenon of Byzantine overstriking. And I do have a final note, actually. So you may have noticed that all of the examples I have cited heretofore have been copper, or copper and base metal coins. And that's true, because as far as I'm aware, the phenomenon of overstriking was far more common on copper coins than it was on gold. There may also be a degree of sort of survivor bias here, because it may just be that the copper coins survived in much greater numbers due to the fact that they're much less useful to melt down in large quantities if people found them in the Middle Ages or modernity even, whereas gold obviously still has a great sort of bullion value to melt it down, as tragic as it is to imagine melting down an ancient coin. So surviving gold overstrikes are very rare, but they do happen. This image that I've shown you here on the left, this is a solidus or nomisma of Maurice Tiberius, the poor emperor who was overthrown by Phocas, which is overstruck on another solidus nomisma of Anastasios, who had ruled almost a century before. So this gold coin would have been circulating for a minimum of 70 years before being restruck by Maurice. This is in my collection. It is the highlight. And then on my on the right-hand side here is another overstruck solidus nomisma of Justinian on an unknown host coin. Again, I think through some sleuthing and research, we could probably identify it. But one of the key giveaways is that you have an inscription which doesn't really belong here. And then you have also several of these rims which indicate that there was something else originally there. Okay, so that's my last note on Byzantine overstrikes. And I'll go to my conclusions now, and then I would love to have questions and discussions and any feedback that you all have. So overstriking obviously performed a number of functions in the pre-modern state and the pre-modern economy. I've outlined things such as seigniorage, which is the sort of gap or the gulf or the profit between what the state acquires bullion or currency for and what they value it at and distribute and pay it at. So it's a way that the state makes a profit, basically. I've also discussed the paucity of bullion and the ways in which it was sort of inelastic in a lot of the Byzantine periods, and the cost of restriking versus melting everything down, creating new dyes or blanks, that sort of thing. I've talked about the politics of Damnatio Memoriae, which is a Latin term meaning to condemn someone's memory. This was really common in sort of ancient Roman imperial politics. And so I imagine that by the Byzantine period, literally stamping your face over someone else's face makes a really impactful statement about who is holding power, who is holding sway and imperium. And then finally, I think dynastic politics also play a role here, because it's a way of showing that a particular emperor or empress and their family, in many cases, are now the ones who are in control, and they're the ones who you're going to see on a daily basis when you're using these transactions, or when you're using these coins for transactions in the agora. So for me, according to me, the significance of these coins is that rather than representing poor minting or inattention or someone being drunk at work, overstriking was a very complex phenomenon in Byzantium, which can reveal all these different insights into the state, its economy, and its politics. And if we overlook it, we do so at a detriment to ourselves and our understanding of the past. I'm going to leave you with this coin because it's amazing. And I just thank you all so much for your time and your attention. If you have comments or questions or feedback, I would be more than happy to chat about it and discuss it. This is my University of Minnesota email, real straightforward, just magnolia@umn.edu. And yeah, thank you all so much.
So yeah, let's open it up. If anybody has any questions, Alex, I'll kick it off. That way, if anybody else has any questions, they can take the time to plug it in. You just made a comment about the overstriking and what a powerful statement it makes to put your face over somebody else's face. So other than it being a simpler process, why not just melt it down and make a totally brand new coin where the other person's face is not even there at all, and there's no other information, and you kind of erase that history? Is it just because it's easier to overstrike?
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. And I don't have an answer for it. I don't know the answer. It's no. I can definitely speculate based on my understanding. So as I said, we have no sources of people actually talking about this, and it's really frustrating because we know that overstriking was happening on a huge scale in the 7th century and again in the Macedonian period. But we don't have like historians and commentators in that period saying, and then Heraclius overstruck these coins because it was cheaper, or Heraclius overstruck them in order to keep the memory of Phocas alive. But if we keep, for example, with that theme a little bit and look at other histories, in Byzantium, I think there are sort of two ways of thinking about this. So in some cases, court historians and almost sort of spin doctors, I hate that term, it's very modern, but anyway, people interested in crafting narratives would keep alive the memory of bad emperors and discuss them along certain lines and tropes. Like one of the most famous ones is if a bad emperor dies while in office, it's always because he did something impious. Like he took a crown out of the Hagia Sophia. So rather than just like removing this person's name from the record altogether, there would be a sort of didactic story about it. Like, don't be like this guy because he took a crown out of the church and then got carbuncles and died. I think one of them literally, like he took a sort of donative crown from the Hagia Sophia and put it on his head, and then he got like boils on his head and died shortly thereafter, according to these histories, right? So it's probably not what happened, but overstriking and leaving the image, I think the main answer is that it's just cheaper to do it that way. Yes. But also maybe it does
it's retain.
Yeah, maybe it retains some degree of memory. Like, you know what happened to Phocas? He got literally stamped out. So don't you guys get any ideas?
No, that makes sense. Hey, we do have a couple questions, so forgive me. I didn't mean to take over. Susan Sims was wondering, so she says, were overstrikes only on copper coins? She says, I noted a few gold, but no other metals?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Susan. That's a great question. So copper seems to be the most common in terms of coins that have survived. Um, I indicated that, there are some gold overstrikes. They definitely exist, but it may just be that Byzantine gold has survived at a lower rate than copper in general because it was more useful to melt it down in various periods of human history. Like it, I mean, that's my point, is that if you have a copper coin and a gold coin, the gold is far more liquid than the copper if you melted that down in terms of, you're a sort of wildcat archaeologist operating in the 1800s. Um, Other than that, yeah, one would think that due to the hardness or rather softness of gold, that it would be easier to overstrike it. But that's a great question. I don't have a good answer for it. Um, as for silver, that's actually it's a really fascinating question because many historians believe that the Byzantine miliaresion, this sort of medium value silver coin, I'll jump back to it because I just like that image of the miliaresion a lot. Many historians think that this coin was actually made to compete with the Arabic dirham because they're roughly the same dimensions. And actually, a lot of miliaresia, which is the plural of miliaresion, a lot of them are overstruck on dirhams of the Abbasid Islamic Empire. So in that case, it might absolutely be a sort of statement about the triumph of Christianity and literally this gigantic cross on steps having overstruck an Islamic a coin. They don't have images; they just have words. But yeah, I didn't mention the connections between the miliaresion and the dirham because I was having trouble fitting it into the presentation in a good way. But that's a really good question. Thank you. As far as Byzantine overstrikes of certain emperors over other emperors on silver, I don't know of any of those examples.
William is asking, did they ever overstrike on one side to indicate the bearer that the old coin had good metal of a higher standard than those of the present?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. Particularly when thinking about the Brazilian example that I noted, because that was not only an overstrike but a revaluation, right? Um, I'm aware of certain counter marks in Byzantine coins, but I don't necessarily think that carried a corresponding change in the value. So some coins are certainly stamped, I think, either in Sicily or Syracuse with a very specific counter mark or almost a privy mark indicating that they were stamped in Sicily or Syracuse. But I don't know if that comes with a corresponding change in value. Um, so to your point that a certain coin had a good metal of higher standard than those of the present, um, I imagine one of the reasons that a lot of these coins survived is that, debasement happened regularly, and there would be periods where for a century or more, the size of the coin would go down but be worth the same value, or, you know, various types of gold debasement in particular. And then a new dynasty would come in and sort of revamp the gold to the extent that in, I think, the 12th century or maybe the 13th century, there's even a new coin released called the Hyperpyron, Hyperpyron, or Hyperpyron. Anyway, which means like super refined, hyper refined, super pure. So they literally renamed the coin to say this is a super good gold coin and it's worth a lot. So there definitely were attempts to sort of get around debasement or to talk about debasement, but as far as I know, that was not achieved through strikes and countermarks and things like that.
Keep it open for a little bit longer if anybody else has questions.
Absolutely.
They can put it in the chat or the Q&A. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, including yours, Alex. Yeah.
Oh, sure. No worries. I also, I forgot to cite my sources. There are sources if you'd like to refer to them. As I said, there's not a ton of academic sources about Byzantine overstrikes, but I'm always looking for more. Thank you, Susan. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. No, I share her sentiment right there. This was fascinating, and I geek out on on all topics numismatic. I'm a nerd, but specifically very, very, very old coins and anything in that era. So I thank you. Well, shoot, I'm going to go ahead if we don't have any other further questions, and we'll go ahead and close it out. Unless, again, like I said, if anybody has anything else for Alex, thank you. So honestly, thank you for your time. Thank you for this presentation. It was amazing. It was wonderful and educational. I hope everyone enjoyed it and learned as much as I did. And again, we would like to thank Graysheet and their partnership for the ANA eLearning Academy, which makes all of this available. And so we hope you'll join us for future webinars, and everyone have a wonderful day.